So you want to build like this guy, fWhip, or fWhip, whatever you want to call him. fWhip has been making videos on YouTube now for more than 7 years, mainly focused on survival building. Now, my opinion might be a little biased because I started building in Minecraft mainly because of this guy, but I think anyone can agree that fWhip's builds are definitely something special. So it makes sense why you would want to build like fWhip, but how? Well, to answer that, we need to take a good look at fWhip's builds. Now, apart from the mega build every once in a while, fWhip usually builds in a medieval style. We're gonna keep that in mind because it's gonna be very important later. Now, something else we can take away from fWhip's builds is that their shape is more or less never a square box. And sure, maybe the random farmhouse every once in a while will have a more basic shape, but still, these builds all have some sort of jutting out area or tower, chimney, anything that makes the shape less boring and the build more interesting. In general, that's a great trick, by the way. If you're struggling with building, is just make the shape more interesting and your build will look 100% better in the end. Anyway, there's a couple ways fWhip likes to vary the shape of his builds, and some of them are adding towers, bringing the second floor out by a block or two, overlapping the roof, and honestly way too many more that we could be here forever. So at the core, fWhip's build style is medieval houses or buildings that have interesting shapes in all kinds of ways. If you want the really bare bones version of it, that's it. But now to add to that, we can take a look at how fWhip chooses his color palettes, meaning the blocks he chooses to build with. Usually, because fWhip plays in survival, his starter house and starter area use pretty basic materials. However, after that, the block palettes change up a lot from build to build. I think really all it comes down to is trying new things, because just like any good builder, fWhip knows that to get better at building, it's important to try new things with your builds. And when it comes to block palettes, you can definitely see this. If we take a look into fWhip's mind, I think a lot of what it comes down to is let's try this because it sounds fun or cool. Now that might not work for all the time, but I think it's a good way to go about it. Now, quick disclaimer, these words are coming out of my mouth, not fWhip's. This is purely opinion based. I just think in general, this is his mindset when it comes to building. Moving on though, if you want to come up with cool block palettes like the one fWhip uses, my best advice would be to go in a random creative world and scroll through the block menu for a little bit. You might find some cool blocks or colors to add to your builds. When it comes to this too, you have to think outside the box, almost as if every block is a specific color and not what it's called. I repeat this all the time, however, I think it's really helpful to switch your mindset from this being cobblestone to a shade of gray. And the reason a lot of good builders do this is because once you get to a certain distance from a block, the lines in the cobblestone, for example, disappear and blur into, well, a solid shade of gray. Another good example is nether gold ore and crafting tables are exactly the same color from a distance. Also, I completely stole that example from Snarple, so go check him out. He's a great builder. Anyway, all of this to say that when you're scrolling through the creative menu, try to think with that mindset, because otherwise you might not try to use a block like netherrack, for example, but as this build in fWhip's hardcore city demonstrates, it can be a really good building block. So hopefully that's not too overwhelming and it makes sense. In general, just try to look at blocks as colors and try to use them in a way you would almost use in a painting. Let's move on though, to maybe the most important aspect of fWhip's building, and that is blending your builds with the surrounding area. Now you can do this by building a tree in front of your house, for example. Also, adding a path can help. You can put up retaining walls like here with this tuck, and of course fWhip's specialty, you can build fields, and you can also build small carts on the road because carts are cool. But all these things help add life to your build and make it look like it's a part of the environment. There's a lot of small things you can add around a build to make it feel less isolated and more alive. So if you still build something in the open and then stop adding to it when the main building is done, then maybe try adding a road and maybe a couple trees in front. In general, small things that show the build actually belongs there instead of just looking like it fell out of the sky, but it doesn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the area. Basically, that's a complicated way of saying if your build looks out of place, then add a thing or two to show that the build actually belongs with that terrain. For the last year or two, I've been adding trees into my builds a lot more, and you'd be surprised how much it can improve a build. And the bonus of that is if there's a side of a building you don't like as much, you can just hide it with a tree. Again, in fWhip's hardcore world here, it's clear that none of his builds are standalone. They all have something going on more than just being a random build in the middle of nowhere. And while we're paying attention to it, you probably notice that all the builds in fWhip's world are connected by a path. Even if we go back to older worlds fWhip build, it's a consistent theme that every build is connected in some sort of way. And that brings up the next point, which is fWhip never really builds a mega base or single build in his world. As fWhip said himself, his goal is to build an interconnected medieval fantasy world.
My goal is to build an entire interconnected fantasy world.
That's for his hardcore world, but even in other worlds, like fWhip's base on Empire Season 2, his bases consist of multiple builds that all come together to make something really impressive in my opinion. So if you want to build like fWhip, then building small villages, towns, or even cities is the way to go. I'm not saying that building a mega base or one giant build is bad, but however, if you want to build like fWhip, then building settlements is the way to go about it. Okay, so now this might only really apply to people who play survival, but it can still help you get inspiration. So some of the builds fWhip makes actually have some kind of mob associated with it. Like for example, these brown mushroom or these sniffers or even these sheep. When you go through the trouble of bringing a cool mob and incorporating it somehow into your build, it's going to add a bit of a story and maybe memories of struggling to get that mob there. And when a build reminds you of something, your brain is usually going to associate that build with a specific feeling. Now it's a little harder to do in creative world because spawning a mob is a lot less memorable than having to go out in the world to find it. But in general, the different mobs in the game can inspire you to build something cool. Like maybe you can put a Jeb sheep on display like fWhip did here in his sheep farm. Hey, if you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing because I'll be posting a lot more videos like this, and since this is a new channel, it would actually help a lot. Thank you. Now I'll stop annoying you, we can get back to the video. Okay, at this point I think you should have a pretty decent idea of how fWhip builds in Minecraft. He builds in a fantasy medieval style while making sure the shape stays interesting and not boring. The block palettes he uses usually have some kind of pop of color or block that are less popular for building. What makes his builds feel a part of the environment instead of standalone buildings. Finally, he usually focuses on building areas instead of a singular build, and a lot of his builds are inspired by some kind of Minecraft mob or block. I think this is enough information to be able to build something great that is going to be very similar to something fWhip would build himself. Hopefully this isn't too confusing, but just to show you that these tricks can actually help you build like fWhip, I'm going to put all of them to the test by building something cool, and hopefully by the end it's similar to something fWhip would build. Before that though, I think it's clear, but don't copy other people's builds, because chances are that person put a lot of effort into building something just for it to be stolen. My goal is to show you how to build like fWhip, not to replicate his builds or steal them. So I just wanted to get that out there, but anyway, let's get started on the build. So this one's actually pretty big. As I mentioned earlier, fWhip likes to build environments instead of singular builds, so I'm going to be doing exactly that. As I start getting the general plans down, I just want to mention that fWhip is an excellent builder and his build style is very complex, so I'm trying to cover as much as I can without it getting too complicated. Anyway, I started by getting a general idea for where I wanted the buildings to go, as well as the road, and a couple of fields as you can see outlined here with leaves. But after that, I was pretty happy with the layout of this small village, so I started working on the build, starting with the biggest one on top of this hill. I used the same block palette from fWhip's starter area in his hardcore world, while also of course adding a couple different features. But I capped it off with a deep slate roof and moved on to the next house. For this one, it's basically the exact same thing, but I did change the roof for some oxidized copper. I think it works well here and it adds a bit of a pop of color. This is also supposed to be a barn kind of building, so I made the roof a little more barn-like with slabs. I don't know, but it looks cool. Anyway, moving on to yet another build. This one I decided to make a horse stable. You'll notice that I really took inspiration from mobs with the previous build and this horse stable. I think it would be a good way to show different ways you can take inspiration from the different mobs in the game. But again, just a very simple build with 2 towers for airflow in a building that probably doesn't smell the best with all these horses in it. And of course, we can't forget the 3 spots for the horses. And now last but not least, this build here, I wanted to make some sort of a bee greenhouse, so I did exactly that. Again, just using the same techniques for the other builds. And finally, I actually lied, this is the last building here, but it's just a mine entrance because I thought it would be cool. Next, to bring all these different builds together into more of a cohesive village, I obviously built out the road a little thicker going all the way around. I used world edit for this, which is why a lot of blocks are changing all at once. But after that, it was time to add the trees. In my opinion, this is one of the most important parts of a build like this. So I made sure I liked where every tree was, and I just copy pasted a couple of pre-made designs around the entire build. Lastly, I just bone mealed the area and added a bunch of flowers. Oh, and also I added crops to the fields as well as sheep and cows to the pens. So with the build fully done, I think it's clear that by following all the techniques in this video, you can build something pretty similar to what fWhip would build. I personally wanted to create something similar to this area of fWhip's hardcore world, but you can apply these tricks to basically any build, the only difference being maybe the block palette. But as you can see, I built all the builds in a medieval style. None of the buildings have a boring shape, whether it's a chimney or a tower. They all have something interesting going on for their shape. As you can tell, I used a little bit of copper, which helps add a pop of color. Instead of building a single house, I built a small village, and with 3 of these houses, I included and took inspiration from mobs, like the greenhouse for these bees. Also, I made sure to keep it accurate to fWhip's builds by not doing a single interior in the entire village. But with that, I hope this video was helpful. If you want to learn something new about building every once in a while, consider subscribing. And also, while you're down there, if you could like the video, that would mean a lot. Thanks for watching and have a good day.